You hear me? That sounded good. So it's the magic hour of 11:30. I'm Dion Chase, a graduate student here at OHSU, and it's my pleasure today to introduce to you Gary Olson. Gary is a Donald Brand Distinguished Professor of Informatics at UC Irvine, and he's also a Professor Emeritus from Michigan. His doctorate originally was in psychology from Stanford, but we won't hold that against him. He's a fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery, the Association for Psychology, the American Psychological Association, member of the Chi Academy, and winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award for computer human interaction. He's a member of the editorial board of 9 significant journals, so be nice to you if you want to publish in this area. And is a consultant to literally a score of others. His list of grants spans 3 pages. His list of publications takes an additional 10. I'm not going to go into that in more detail, but I know he's not padding it because he hasn't listed the 3 on Swiss railroads. They're not on there either. So he's got a wide range of interests. He's very accomplished as a researcher, as an administrator. He's been the interim dean of the School of Informatics, and an administrator, running project teams and grants. So he actually has had experience in all these areas. He is a leading thinker in both cognitive science and human-computer interaction, especially as it applies to computer-supported collaborative work. And he's the type of person that Google comes to, and Google says, we've got some money. What do you want to do? And he's a good person to be around. I actually met him and his wife Judy last winter when I went to the Computer Supported Collaborative Work Conference up in Seattle. And I heard a presentation of what they're doing, and I said, this is a person I've got to have on my committee. And I'm very lucky and very proud that he's doing. He gave us a choice of topics today, and the fellows voted. And what we decided we'd like to hear him talk about was basically an overview of the work they've been doing over the last several decades on how people work together over distance. On an administrative note, if you have a question for Gary, this is being videotaped and disseminated live. So please push the button in front of you when you ask a question, as normal. And Gary, we're delighted to hear you, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thanks much. So I'm going to talk about working together apart. That's kind of the latest turn of phrase we're using for this body of work, and as Dion said, it spans probably back into the early to mid-1980s we've been working on this topic. I'm going to use the word we a lot because the work itself is highly collaborative. My wife Judy and I have been working together ever since we got married 30 years ago. But these are Steve Abrams and Matt Beats are a couple of postdocs who had worked with us recently. Julia Haynes is a PhD student. Jing Wen got her master's degree at the University of Minnesota and is now a full-time research associate in our lab. And we've had largesse of financial support for this work as well over the years. Actually, probably our principal supporter over the whole time period of, say, 25 years has been the National Science Foundation. The thing we've worked on most recently is something we call the Collaboration Success Wizard, which is an online tool to assess how your collaboration is going and give you feedback. So I'm going to talk about the work that underlies it, and then come back and talk about the wizard itself. So I'm kind of using the wizard as the frame for this talk. It's turned out to be a useful tool. It tells you where things in your project are strong, what you might be vulnerable to, and what to do about it. And I'll give you some examples later when I talk more about it in a little detail. The wizard is based on a lot of work. As I say, we've had more than 20 years of research, mostly on scientific collaboration. I guess that reflects the fact that a lot of our funding has come from the National Science Foundation. But we also have studied business collaborations. Judy at Michigan was in the business school, and she now actually has an honorary appointment in the business school at Irvine. And so we had access to a number of businesses that do long-distance collaboration. And we've done a lot of work. We've collected a lot of data over the years, and we've done a lot of work on what factors seem to differentiate successful from unsuccessful collaborations. And so that's the primary database that's now quite enormous. We did a kind of a summary of this work back in the late 90s, published this paper in the year 2000 called Distance Matters. It was kind of a summary of where we thought things were at that point in time. More recently, we put out a book on the work we've done on scientific collaboration, and Chapter 4 in this book is sort of an update of what we wrote back in 2000. We've changed our ideas a little bit because things have happened. We've learned some new things. The book also has a lot of case studies about specific projects that we looked at in some detail. We're working on another book. This one we hope to finish in the next month or so. It's called Working Together Apart. It's part of a series put out by Morgan and Claypool, which is a publishing firm. It's a subsidiary of Morgan Kaufman. And they published what they call synthesis lectures on various topics, mostly in science and engineering. And they do have one in what they call human-centered informatics. And so we've got a contract with them to put this monograph out. And it'll bring the story yet further up to date because we've learned some things even since the 2008 book. Developing our ideas here have come from several sources. One is kind of an empirical part, which is we've gathered an enormous amount of data, both in breadth and in depth, and we've put a lot of effort into looking at sort of what differentiates successful from unsuccessful collaboration. But of course, we've also mined the literature as well. There's by now a huge literature. A lot of other people are interested in this topic. A large literature it turns out in a number of different domains, not just in the CSCW world, but in the business literature, in the communication studies literature, and so on. And one little frustration is a lot of these literatures are kind of disjoint. They don't cite each other and so on, so it's a little bit tricky to go and try to find all the things that are relevant. But there's a lot known out there, and so we have a kind of a rich empirical base, both from our own work and from the work of others, to come up with these ideas. Our empirical part has had sort of two strategies. One is kind of a breadth strategy. We have a database of projects, mostly in scientific collaboration, although even recently there's been an emergence of long-distance technology-mediated collaboration in the humanities, which is kind of an interesting development, and we're kind of looking at that especially right now. But our database has more than 750 examples of projects. So it just grows. I mean, when we moved to Irvine in 2008, our database had about 250 projects in it. We hired a postdoc just to do the update of the database, and she was able to find another 500 projects. So it's just a growing area, and I think it's come to the point in time where working with people who aren't in your physical location is just a normal activity now. It's still not easy, as I'll point out, but it's become very common. So the one goal is for each of the 750 projects, get a little bit of information about what happened, mine websites, publications, things like that. But of course, especially when you're talking about projects that didn't work out, people tend not to self-disclose that. So we've had to do some kind of more in-depth work. So we've, here's just shows you we have a database that's online. Here's the URL. And this is just a snapshot of the first part of the letter A in that database. That database has both a public and a private part. The public part has a lot of kind of general information. When we've gone and done detailed interviews and observations, that's in the private part of this database. And we'd have to discuss with people what the conditions would be for access to that. Here's just an example of a particular project, the Biomedical Informatics Research Network, which is one of the particularly interesting ones that we looked at in some depth. So to complement this kind of breadth thing, we've done in-depth studies of a number of projects, kind of an alphabet soup of projects, some that we were involved directly in. So for example, this upper atmospheric research collaborator is one we did at Michigan. We had a decade of funding from NSF to do that one. Similarly with the Great Lakes Center for Age Research, Michigan was one of the Big Ten universities involved in that. We were heavily involved in the NEAS project on earthquake engineering. But others we had contacts with and were able to kind of go and find out in more detail what actually really happened with these projects. And when I mentioned that in the 2008 book there are case studies, almost all of these are written up as case studies in that volume, if you're interested in more details about any of them. So here are some examples of projects we were involved in. We actually were involved not just in studying them, but we actually were building the software for them. So in the upper atmospheric physics project, we built all the software over the period of a decade. And similarly with the NEAS project in earthquake engineering, at least during the first 3 or 4 years, we were working collaboratively with the National Center for Supercomputing Applications to build applications for that. Here's I'm going to do kind of a quick overview of what we call the theory of remote scientific collaboration. Actually, calling it a theory was Judy's idea, and I don't mean that apologetically. I think it's sort of more a set of working hypotheses rather than a fully formed theory, but theory, I guess, is a kind of a more attractive or attention-getting term. So we've kind of grouped our ideas about what matters into 5 broad categories: the nature of the work, common ground, collaboration, readiness, things having to do with management and decision-making, and technology readiness. Each of those, in turn, has a lot of structure embedded in them, so that if you the Collaboration Success Wizard, which I introduced briefly, to tap these topics has on the order of 50-ish questions in the online survey. So there's a lot of sub-points to all of this. So let me just quickly kind of go through each of these things. By the way, if you have questions as I go along, I'm happy to field questions on the fly. Nature of the work has to do with what is it you're doing. And it turns out that work varies quite widely. And the kind of work that's relatively easy to do when you're geographically distributed is work that is easily divided up. So you can assign responsibility for different parts of the project to different people involved in the project. Obviously, you don't want total independence because it's a collaboration. You want to have some way of putting these pieces together and so on. Similarly, you want to make sure that you don't drift apart in terms of kind of the overriding vision of the project and so on. But we've seen examples, particularly in business, where they've tried to take really hard problems and have them done geographically distributed, that there's a lot of trouble. So what you're doing matters a lot. Common ground has to do with what the participants share in terms of their knowledge, their experience with working with each other, their vocabulary, kind of a common way of going about work. And we've seen some projects that had kind of some early struggles, which put a lot of energy into this matter. A particular biomedical project we studied that was headquartered at Columbia, they spent a year building a dictionary because it turns out, it's my experience with the biomedical world, is the terminology is not common. There's a lot of disagreement as to what you call things, and it's important to get those kinds of things straightened out. This bioinformatics research network, which focused, well, the part that we studied in most detail, focused on gathering MRIs from schizophrenic patients from about 20 research centers. Again, they spent a lot of time into developing an ontology, so they knew what they were all talking about in terms of brain structure, brain function, and so on. So that's an important part. Collaboration readiness is, I think, an especially interesting and tricky one because the question is, why are you working together? And there tend to be lots of reasons. I mean, a good reason to work together is because you've had success working together in the past. In fact, Sarah Kiesler and Jonathan Cummings published a paper recently that looked at a whole series of National Science Foundation projects, and they found that was a really key factor in whether your future collaborations were successful, that you built on past successful ones. So that's important. But people collaborate for all kinds of reasons. Again, kind of a good reason is that you need a particular constellation of specialties or of expertise. But if you don't have the right expertise in your own organization, you have to go find it. You may be looking for people you don't know very well, who have different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of work styles, and so on. So that can be tricky. Probably the most risky reason for working together is because funders say you have to. There's more and more a culture these days in the funding organizations to require or reward collaborative work, collaborative research. And in fact, certainly in the European Union, they have really complicated collaborations that they force you to put together because they want to make sure that the most prosperous members of the European Union are working with their colleagues in the less prosperous countries. And so you have to put together a big project. You have to have representation from different parts of the European Union. Well, those are very risky because if you're trying to get the money, if you want to get the money and you're trying to get it by putting together a team, and often a team where you don't know the participants extremely well, it can be very, very tricky. And so that's one, mandate from the funder is kind of a risky one. We've told this to funders, and they're aware of that. And of course, they're very interested in our story about what makes things work. And we've given this presentation to both NSF and NIH, to program managers, and they're extremely interested in these ideas as ways of thinking about how to help encourage successful collaborations among people putting the proposals in. Another component of collaboration readiness is how much you trust your colleagues. Are you confident that when they say they're going to do something, they will do it and they'll do it right? Will things like decisions about how to allocate resources be done with everybody's best interests? That's a really tricky one. And some of the work we've done recently with the Wizard, that's one of the factors that has surfaced the most often is, well, I'm not sure that the project leadership values what I do enough to give me some resources. And that's a really tricky issue. Are the goals aligned? Is everyone seeking more or less the same thing? Often that's not the case. The goals are often very different. And there's a concept that's come out of the psychological literature called group self-efficacy. Al Bandura, a psychologist, developed the idea of individual self-efficacy, the whole idea that you feel as though you're capable of doing something. And Jack Carroll, who's at Penn State and been in this field for a long time, several years ago came up with the idea of the group counterpart of this. Does the group feel like it can accomplish things? And this has turned out to be a quite interesting concept to look at. Issues about management. Again, in a survey of something like 500 projects at the National Science Foundation, Sarah Kiesler and Jonathan Cummings came up with, I think, two kind of interesting conclusions. First, they found that in this large collection of projects, mostly done in the first decade of the 21st century, we actually had several in that pot, that projects where most of the principals were co-located were on average more successful than projects where they were not co-located. That's the kind of distance matters story. But what they found in the subset that were not co-located, the ones that had some success were the ones that had the best management, were managed the best. And that actually kind of affirms things we've seen in some of our case studies, where there was two projects in higher energy physics that we looked at, where one of them was directed initially by a computer scientist. The second one was directed by a high energy physicist. And in the first year or so of those projects, they were having a lot of trouble. Well, they got some advice, and each project went out and hired an MBA to help manage. These were quite large, complicated projects, multi-million-dollar projects. Well, these were people that had some business experience with managing teams and turning these projects around. Now, both scientists and funders kind of shy away from the idea of hiring expensive business consultants for research projects. But I think there's a kind of a growing awareness that it works. And so certainly for very large projects, this kind of budget line ends up making a lot of sense because you need somebody who has both the knowledge and the time to really kind of pay attention to these kinds of things. So how things work is really, how things are managed is really critical. A good project manager, that seems to be a factor that looms significantly in a lot of the things we've looked at. Good communication plans, that is, are you regularly in touch with people? It's real easy, out of sight, out of mind. It's real easy to forget about the people who aren't at your location. And we find, especially projects where there's kind of a major cluster and then a series of satellites, sometimes the satellites even have just one person, those satellites feel very disconnected from the project. And it really takes a lot of effort on the part of project leadership to make sure that they're included, to make sure you know what they're doing and so on. A real area of problem. Are decisions made fairly? Nothing, bothers people more than feeling like they're being screwed because all the money is going to, the leadership of the project or something like that. Another kind of tricky issue is time zone differences, overlap in your work days and so on. And I could give a whole talk on that one because we've actually been looking at that. We're doing some work now with Google, looking at collaborative projects in the Pacific Rim, where the participants are either in India, China, or in the United States. And just unbelievably complicated issues with both culture and with managing time zone differences. Legal and financial issues. We looked at a very large project in our medical school, and there were some real serious concerns about intellectual property matters that had been overlooked by the project leadership and so on. So as I say, there's lots of kind of detail in unpacking each of these ideas. Technical readiness has to do with several things. Sort of what's the technical sophistication of the people who are working. And since we've been working in this area for 2.5 decades, that's changed enormously. I mean, when we started some projects back around 1990, a lot of the people involved were just barely starting to use email and were uncomfortable with it and so on. You don't see that today. Although, again, we've seen in some biomedical projects, some of the highest level people are kind of anti-keyboard, anti-computer, and their attitudes. We've still seen people who have their secretaries print out their email on paper, and then they write comments on it, and the secretaries type it back in. But that's getting rarer and rarer and rarer. People are pretty comfortable with things like email, some forms of conferencing, and so on. Though, again, in the recent work we've done with the Wizard, we have a whole section on what technologies people are using, and sort of to our surprise, widespread use of email, widespread use of audio conferencing, some use of video conferencing, but lots of things that are out there, blogs, wikis, ways of sharing the applications on your screen, sort of more sophisticated awareness tools, shared calendars and so on, are still not very widely used, at least in the projects that we've been looking at. So there still is kind of enormous opportunity because a lot of these tools are really very powerful. When you look at a sophisticated organization like Google, where they have young, really technically savvy people, they're making very effective use of a wide range of these kinds of tools. And our colleague Jonathan Gruden at Microsoft did some surveys at Microsoft as well and found similar kinds of things. So there are some powerful opportunities here, and the question is how people get comfortable with them. There are also some things happening. We just published a paper, or I just got accepted, that will appear at the CHI conference this spring on cloud computing. So if you are familiar with things like Dropbox or Google Apps, the model that is being proposed there is that everything you're working with is in the cloud, wherever the heck the cloud is. And we have found in interviews with people at mostly at universities so far, enormous confusion about the cloud. What is it? Where is it? Where is my stuff? And people are surprised by things that happen. Even Judy was using Google Docs for her class last year, and we've gotten permission to use some of the material for a research project we're doing with Google, and suddenly these docs are disappearing. And we needed the revision histories because we were studying how they got revised over time, and they started disappearing. And nobody knew why. So that's an example of kind of mysteries in the cloud. Some interesting work with virtual worlds. We have colleagues at Irvine who are studying the role of virtual world technology for supporting software engineering. Some interesting opportunities there. Also, another part of technical readiness is the technical support up to snuff. Because you still, even for things like email, you still have trouble every so often. You need somebody you can call on for help. And often the technical help is very unevenly distributed across some of these projects. And of course, if you're collecting data in many different sites, there can quite quickly get to be issues about standardization, data standards, data sharing, and so on. A lot of the large scientific projects are ones where you share remote instruments. The project we did on upper atmospheric research focused on a community that was using a suite of physical facilities up in Greenland. And in the course of the project, we got those all put on the internet. so they could do real-time data acquisition about things in the upper atmosphere from things that were up in Greenland. Well, a lot of issues about how you manage remote instruments. There are safety issues for certain kinds of instruments. For one of the instruments, there was a big incoherent scatter radar that was about 20 meters across, and you didn't want to be steering that thing around from California if some guy was up there maintaining it. You had to have a lot of information about some of these safety issues. So as I say, there's a wide range of factors, and we're actually, an example of a factor that we sort of insufficiently considered in the past that we're now kind of beginning to think a lot more about is some of the characteristics of the individuals involved, what their kind of psychological, cognitive profiles are, and so on. And that's kind of another wrinkle in all of this about how collaboration works, and that's one we're kind of trying to get our head around right now. So you can say, well, there's an enormous range of things that could go wrong, and the answer is yes, there is. A story, those of us who study collaboration, certainly 10 or 15 years ago, the story was the success rate for collaborations beyond 2 or 3 people is very low. There actually were some figures collected about 15 years ago that said that only like 1 in 3 of these collaborations succeeds by any sort of reasonable measure of success. And I would submit that putting distance into the equation lowers those odds even more. Now, I think that's changed some because we've learned a lot of stuff. And just some examples of things that give us a little bit of optimism. We made a lot of tools. We've made a lot of advances in the last decade or decade and a half on suites of tools for managing knowledge, things like Google Docs and Dropbox and wikis and so on, better awareness support. The whole world of social computing has provided some really interesting opportunities. People are become more sophisticated about project management and how to kind of manage a project over space and time. Tricky set of issues. We've helped better understanding of incentives, how you have to align incentives to get success, and of course a lot of stuff having to do with trust building. A lot of that stuff comes out of the business world, but ends up being quite important. An interesting little tidbit here is a colleague of ours. He was a postdoc in our lab and now is at Carnegie Mellon, and he studies software engineering, and he was studying some projects where they were building telecommunications software with sites in 3 sites in the U.S., a site in the U.K., France, and Germany, and they were actually using things like video conferencing to help make the work. Well, there was an attitude, at least at the time they were doing the project, that video conferencing was kind of expensive and special, and so you would wait for everybody to get there, and then you turn it on, have your meeting, and then turn it off. Well, it turns out a lot of studies by organizational scientists have found that the stuff that happens as you gather for a meeting and the stuff that happens as you break up and walk away, all the kind of informal chatting and so on, is really, really, really important. Well, these people who are doing video conferencing were, thinking that, it's a waste of time for us to sit and talk about soccer or something, over the conference, so we should only talk about the work. Well, what Jim Herbst found was that was a real big mistake. That the parts of the projects he was looking at that were working were ones where people did have informal chit-chat with their colleagues overseas. Talking to your friends in Germany or France about what's going on, what their holidays are, what's happening with their families, and so on. Those kinds of things build up the kind of social glue and trust and respect that make projects work better. So that kind of stuff is really important. The section in bookstores now devoted to how to manage virtual teams just keeps growing and growing and growing because people are making a lot of money on it, at least some of them are. But I think it reflects the fact that we now know a lot. And it takes effort. It helps to know how to make these things work, and it takes effort to do it. You don't get it for free, but we now know a lot. And so there are ways of figuring out what you need to do to make this stuff work. And we hope that our book will be kind of added to that scene. In terms of things like culture and so on, there's a lot of valuable resources out there. There's this book series called Culture Shock. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. it's written by people who are from a different culture and write about what they experienced in a culture. So it's like the one about Germany. Somebody from, I think that one's talked about, somebody from the U.S. talks about what they learned by living in Germany and so on. The most interesting one for us was the one about the U.S., written by somebody who didn't live in the U.S., and all the things they saw when they came. There's a company based in San Francisco that we are working with called GlobeSmart. Aperion is actually the name of the company, but their product is called GlobeSmart. It's an online assessment tool for measuring cultural factors. And it's actually a very empirically based project. They just went through a revision cycle from version X to version Y. I don't remember what the numbers were. But in between, they had administered this to 400,000 people. So they had this enormous database of findings about how people varied on a bunch of dimensions. And their assumption is that, obviously, people within a single culture can be quite varied. There's a whole distribution of kinds of Americans and Swiss and so on. And what they do is they measure your individual profile and then measure the profiles of other members of your team and just see what are some of the disconnects and what you could do about them. And they're kind of like our wizard. When they discover disconnects among the participants, they have some ideas about things you can do to ameliorate those differences. Julia Haynes, who works in our lab, is actually using GlobeSmart in some laboratory studies she's doing of multicultural collaboration. Certainly, Irvine is a very multicultural campus. We have students mostly from the Pacific Rim, but from many different cultural backgrounds. And so she's putting together teams who are doing a task in the laboratory, and she measures their GlobeSmart profiles before they take part in the study, learning some very interesting things about that. Time zones. I think time zones are, I mean, this is an example of something that's never going to go away. And, people talk about, well, so I can work from, 4 in the afternoon until midnight, so I am in better sync with my colleagues. There's been a lot of resistance to that idea. I forget which company it was, Intel or some company, where they had sites, I think it was Intel, because they're local, right? They're in Hillsboro. And then they have a site in the Bay Area, and they have a site in either Bangalore or one of the places in India. And they got enormous resistance from their Indian colleagues to shifting their work days. Because they said, we have families, we have lives. We're not going to shift our work days just to make it easy for you guys on the West Coast to get your work done. So it's a tricky issue that, things that seem like potential solutions are sort of socially awkward. But there's sort of a emerging sort of better tools to support what I call asynchronous awareness, being aware of what your colleagues did when they were working. And that's an area that we're particularly interested in ourselves, because these kind of really super long-distance collaborations are getting more and more and more common, especially in the corporate world. But I'd still argue that despite all these advances, it's really hard. And it was we opened this, or either we open or end this paper on distance matters with an anecdote. There was a book published a while ago called "The Death of Distance," and we argued over and over and over again. It's like Mark Twain's thing about the rumors of my death are somewhat premature. We think that's true of distance as well. That distance is a serious problem, and it'll be there forever in some form. Okay, with that as kind of as a background as to what the material is we're talking about, let me talk a little bit now about the wizard itself. First of all, any questions about the story so far? Yeah.
So you mentioned some technologies to help with the collaboration. For example, Google Docs and Dropbox.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned that you may have lost some documents in Google Docs. We've actually been having discussions here at the university about the use of Google Docs and Dropbox, and there's been some concern about who has access to those, and we just described probably having we weren't even aware of what documents disappeared. Can you speak to that?
Mm-hmm. Turns out I had offered a couple of other topics to talk about, and another one is we're doing a big project with Google studying the rollout of Google apps on university campuses. We're currently looking at 5 UC campuses plus the University of Michigan, where we have strong contacts. And these are all universities that have made their like umish.edu address on email accounts is now a Google Gmail account. And so with using that email address, you've inherited all the Google stuff. And what we're doing is we're surveying. We do an annual survey of students. We've surveyed about 120 students on each of these 6 campuses. And we've done interviews with faculty and graduate students. We've done interviews with administrators responsible for the decision to adopt this infrastructure. And in many cases, the reason for adopting Google Apps as your campus infrastructure is cost. Because what you're doing is you're basically outsourcing the support. Rather than having to keep all your versions up to date and so on through your own IT people, they just happen out there in the cloud. I mean, I don't know, if you're a frequent user of any of this stuff, it can be kind of disconcerting. One day you'll log into Gmail, and the interface is all different. And you were never told about this, and things you could find easily you can't find now, and so on. And then there's this cloud issue. And the whole story I told you about the cloud problems comes from that work. That in our interviews with people, students and faculty and staff, we found that there was just a lot of confusion about that. It's furthermore the case that there is a security concern, and on no campus has the medical school adopted this. So the UCI medical school is not part of this, and so on, because they're just concerned about security issues. We actually were going to do a project with the city of Los Angeles, because they were considering adopting Google Apps. But not only were their social service departments unwilling to, but the police department, the fire department, and so on were unwilling to be part of it. And so that whole project fell through. So there are some really serious security issues with this. And I think people are still very confused about how things are working. And part of the reason we're doing this with Google's financial support is to give them some feedback about, what is it about all the stuff that's bothering people and confusing people and so on. And the good thing is they are listening to us. They've actually made some changes in some of their software based on our findings. So we may make some progress. But I think this whole thing about, it's this funny trade-off that, there's the move for sort of more openness and sharing and collaboration and so on kind of goes against the grain of security and privacy and control, and it's a really complicated issue, and I think it's very much a work in progress, very much a work in progress. So we're not the first people to think about measuring collaboration. IBM has a collaboration assessment tool that sort of focuses at the organizational level. There's a thing called the Collaboration Consortium that is kind of a consortium of companies. Cisco is one of the leaders of that consortium. We've actually worked a lot with that collaboration consortium, including measuring their collaborations, which has been kind of fun. So the idea of kind of figuring out some way of assessing what's going on, so either to understand or to provide feedback or corrections and so on, it's kind of in the air these days. And of course, you're working on it as well in a particular clinical domain. So the Wizard grew out of our work mostly on scientific collaboration, and we've kind of taken our ideas and manifested them in a series of questions. We went through all the development process of making sure, sitting with respondents as they're answering questions so they could explain when they didn't understand things and so on. Because when you do an interview, if somebody's puzzled by your question, you can rephrase it and so on. But when someone's taking an online survey, you're not there anymore. So we did a lot of sort of iterative development to get things to a point where they could be understood. And then, we put all kinds of questions that they answer. The questions have either scales or response choices, but for every single question in the Wizard, we have a free text box if they want to make any additional comments. And it's turned out that's been very useful for us. It's been a way of, evolving the Wizard over time. And we've also learned some interesting things we didn't think to ask about. At the end, if you take the Wizard, it takes you about 20 minutes or so to do the whole thing. You are offered a report, and it says, based on your responses, your project looks like this. And it says, here's some good things that are working well, here's some things that are troublesome, And for the troublesome things, here's some things you could do about it. All that is based on research, either ours or the stuff we draw out of the literature. If we do a project, and our strategy has been to do a project, we've done 12 projects so far involving 200 respondents. And the biggest one was about 40 respondents on one project. The smallest one, I think, was like 5 or 6. And what we do is we sort of manually put together a project-based report to the project leadership. And that's turned out to be very interesting. So we go through all the different responses, both the quantitative responses and all these free text things, and come up with what we saw going on, and then give them particularly a written report, or in some cases we've been willing to show up at a leadership meeting and give them a verbal report as well. And again, the idea is to give them some feedback about how things are going. This just gets sort of a screen dump. Here's what a question looks like. Here's kind of what the beginning of a report looks like. We have 3 versions so far. First of all, it always focuses on a project. Now, we've encountered people have come to us with organizations that are more what I would call consortia, that they are ways of kind of facilitating many projects, and we're kind of in the process of evolving or designing a new version of the wizard that focuses more on that kind of thing, as opposed to a specific project. But right now it focuses on a specific project. You're working on some problem, some number of people over some time period. One is you have a project that's been finished. In that case, the wizard can serve as kind of a data collection device. There was a Superfund research project, or a Superfund project that was, I think, headquartered at Arizona State that we did that with. There's a second version of the wizard which focuses on a project that's currently ongoing. We've done a number of them in that area. And the idea is that you're in the middle of your project, maybe you could benefit from some mid-course feedback and corrections and so on. And one that we've kind of enjoyed a lot is one which are future or planned projects, that you have a group that are about to submit a proposal to some organization, and you'd like to know what you're doing. The very first one of these we did was at UCI. They were going after one of these translational science centers at NIH, and they actually had tried several times before and had got scores that were close, but they didn't get funded. And so they learned about us shortly after we moved to Irvine, and we worked with them. They're the ones that we describe what what we do. They put together. They gave us a list of 70 potential participants in their center. Of those 70, 40 filled the wizard out. So we had a really rich database about what happened. We gave them some very good feedback, both positive and negative. They, in the proposal to NIH, wrote, these experts on collaboration assessed us, and here's what they learned. Here's some strong points about our project. Here's some areas of concern. And for the areas of concern, here's what we're going to do about them. Well, they got funded. Now, I don't think we were the sole reason for it, but it's kind of fun to think we maybe had a little teeny effect on it. Anyway, they got funded. They're about a year and a half into their center now. And so we're just about to go and do a present version of the assessment with that center, because they've had some time to get going, and we want to see to what extent issues we flagged in the proposal stage actually matter then in the operation of the center. And so for a lot of these projects, we'd like to assess them more than once, so we get a sense of how things are unfolding over time. Just this last summer, there were 2 groups that were putting together Science and Technology Center proposals to NSF, and we did them both. The center, no, they're not on this list yet. Anyway, that was a very interesting exercise. And again, they put in their proposals that they'd had gone through this assessment and so on. So we're actually working a lot with different kinds of groups about this. What have we learned? We're kind of in the midst of, we have as I say, we have data from about 200 respondents on 12 different projects. And so we're in the midst of trying to do some more quantitative analysis of all the quantitative information. Of course, we also have all the free text comments, and actually, we find that when people say, I don't know about something that we think is maybe a critical piece of a collaboration, we find that kind of interesting, and they're kind of surprisingly informative. So we're in the middle of doing a lot of this more detailed work on this very large database we've created. Here's a couple of testimonials. The Collaboration Consortium, which was a midterm assessment, talked about how it actually helped them make some changes for year 3 in their project. And this nano structures for electrical energy storage, again, felt like they had learned some things about their project that allowed them to make some changes in how they were going to run it in subsequent years. We actually find that even without our reports, people report to us that just taking the wizard sensitizes them to issues that are going on. I never thought to ask that question, they would say, things like that. So it's actually just a helpful device as a kind of way of increasing your awareness of kind of the issues you should be thinking about. As I said, we're just beginning some quantitative analysis of all this. And, there's lots of issues. There's lots of covariation in their responses and so on. I just want to give you a couple of examples of some preliminary things we've seen. One of the questions we asked them kind of late is, and again, it's phrased differently depending on whether it's a past, present, or future project. But these are self-reported measures of success. Lots of ways to measure success, but that's one. Do you think your project is successful? Do you think it will be successful if it's a future project, and so on? And we found that some aspects of collaboration readiness correlate significantly with that success measure, having a common ground. Nature of the work, less so. So it suggests that people often ask us of these 5 sets of factors, which are the most important? Well, the goal of this phase is to try to get an answer to that. And at least there's a suggestion here that something like collaboration readiness and common ground are maybe more important than the nature of the work. That's a very tentative one. And we get some pretty significant correlations with management and planning issues. And I mentioned there's already a fair amount of evidence that that's something that's pretty important. As I say, there's probably a whole lot of collinearity among all these specific things here. So we have some real serious work to do in unpacking all that. But I just want to give you a sense that some of the things we're measuring are at least correlated in a significant way with a simple outcome measure about these perceived success by project participants. Based on our initial experience, we created Wizard 2.0, which was announced a little less than a year ago at the Science of Team Science conference in Chicago. We kind of rolled it out there. We completely rewrote it on a new modular platform. It's written in Lime Survey, if you're familiar with that. It's an open source survey engine. And we wrote it in a modular way to make it much easier to tailor questions and so on, and to go beyond just team science. We want to be able to look at collaboration in other kinds of areas. And we've dropped some questions, refined some questions, and so on, fine-tuned our report generation. If you're interested in the wizard, we have a website, hana.ics.uci.edu/wizard, with some background information about the project and what it's all about. And if you are interested in using it, there's a process there for applying. What we do is we have you fill out a form that says something about your project and its characteristics and so on, to see if it fits the way the presuppositions built into the wizard. If it is, then we set up a site and ask for a list of people's emails, and we send out an email inviting them then to come in and take the wizard. And we actually often have the project leadership send out the invitation, because that's in many cases more persuasive. In fact, for the ICTS one at the UCI Medical Center, we actually had the dean of the medical school send out the invitation. That kind of got people's attention. And what we typically do is have the wizard available for like 2 or 3 weeks, and during that time we'll send out 1 or 2 reminders about it. And if something special comes up, we've had cases like, I remember one case where some big deadline happened to come close to the end of our wizard period, so we extended the time period to give more people a chance to respond and so on. We can be interactive that way. So each person gets an individual report. As I say, we put together a group report based on all the individual responses. And we think of this as kind of a win-win situation, because you get some feedback, some information, and of course we get a lot of data, which is kind of what our business is about. Anyway, that's the URL for the wizard, and that's the story on the wizard and collaboration. I think there's time for a few questions. Yeah.
I'll ask an applied question, if I may. Many of our departmental courses require small, short-term projects that will last a quarter. What recommendations would you have for both technology and for running the collaboration during that time period?
That's a really good question. Judy teaches a lot of classes just exactly like that. We have a senior capstone project where students, it's actually a year-long project course for our seniors in informatics. And she also teaches a project management course. She taught it just like an hour ago, which she puts kids into teams and they do a term project. And she says, and we've been using Google Docs heavily, or Google Apps. So they use Docs and other Google tools, Google Calendar and so on, with some issues. But she says that she actually does a lot of instruction about team building, how to be an effective team. Because at least seniors at UC Irvine, it doesn't seem to be a natural concept to them. And she says, my job is as much social worker and counselor as it is, academic instructor. She actually, I think she's actually written down a number of the things that she has to do to make this kind of work effectively. So I could, if you drop me a note, I could probably forward you her information. Because I think she has had a lot of experience with this now, both at Michigan and now at Irvine. And there are some things about, it's a struggle sometimes to get things to work well. And she has a lot of insight into that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah.
So, one of the reasons, certainly not the only reason, because I think that you listed a lot of good reasons for doing remote collaboration, but one of the reasons, in my experience, people do remote collaboration is because they want to save money on labor and they want to outsource it to places that are cheaper. And one of the things that is often doesn't seem to be taken into consideration is, the extra overhead or the extra effort in making those collaborations successful, as opposed to if all the people were co-located.
Yep.
Do you have any kind of estimate of what that overhead or extra effort would be, so that one could make a reasoned, estimate of if there really was going to be any savings, or if the project was likely to be successful because they were willing to put in that extra overhead?
Well, I think you flagged a really interesting issue, because sometimes when people are doing the accounting, they don't count like their time, like especially a project leader, who might have all kinds of headaches because they have to manage some group in China or India or wherever, and not dealing with a lot of issues. Somehow that doesn't appear in their NSF budget, so it doesn't kind of get counted. But if you actually really did an accurate cost accounting, I think you would find it might either be a wash or more expensive. There's a guy from Stanford, Steve Barley, just gave a talk at UCI this fall. And he's done a lot of work with General Motors. And they had outsourced, and for cost reasons, had outsourced a lot of their engineering design to India. And one of the things they found was that young people in India don't have cars. And so they don't know what cars look like or how they work. And one designer had designed half of a car, and then just said, well, I can make the whole car by just making a mirror image of that. Well, the car had 2 steering wheels, 2 gas tank and things, and so on, because they didn't know what a car was. So they were really smart engineers, but they missed some very practical, everyday knowledge to do this task right. And so, Jim had to spend a whole lot of money then fixing all this kind of stuff. That's kind of a concrete example of the problem you're talking about. But I think it is really, and that's why I think you'd want to have, before you made any kind of big commitment along those lines, you probably want to try something out on a small scale to get some sense of how big those issues are. I think they are there. I know of some very successful collaborations. I have a colleague at Irvine who works very closely with a group at National University of Singapore. And they've worked together for, I don't know, at least half a decade, if not longer. And it seems to go very well. He does spend a lot of time there. He probably spends 3 or 4 months a year in Singapore. But a lot of the work is done when they're not together. and they've figured it all out. But there's a huge history of investment to make it work smoothly.
There's a huge variance. I mean,
Yeah. Well, I say also probably depends a lot on the area. Some areas have knowledge that's easy to export. Some engineering areas, for example, and some areas have really difficult to export the relevant expertise.
Also, the sort of level of quality or level of work that is acceptable.
Yeah.
I mean, one company I have previous experience with that people are probably sick of me talking about, some of the friends I have that are still working there say that what is accepted and shipped is of lower quality than what they used to find required, and part of that is because of this remote collaboration.
Talk to Boeing or Airbus about that. They've had a lot of experience with that. One of the another thing we've been looking at is I mentioned just briefly that Julia Haynes is working on this Pacific Rim collaboration thing, and one of the fairly surprising things she found. She's been an intern at Google a couple times. She's kind of an inside Googler by now, and she looked at, and I did some of this work with her, people who come from China and India and work for Google, either still in Beijing or still in Bangalore, or now in Mountain View. And it turns out the people in Mountain View are the most unhappy because they're put into a new culture and all kinds of expectations about them that don't fit their experience. Whereas the people, and so they're, and the way Julia puts it is, the people in Bangalore working with Google, they can be like Google for brief periods of time, like when they're doing a video conference or something like that. But the rest of the time, they're living in their home culture. Whereas when you move, you're expected to do everything in that new culture, and that's much more difficult. And it's particularly difficult about some of the informal social things, and the Google has a very odd culture of peer evaluation, that your evaluation is done, but not by your manager, but by your peers. Well, that's quite alien to a lot of Asians. Although I've learned that some Americans find it pretty alien too. But so there are all kinds of things about how Google runs that kind of make it hard for people who move, who are transplanted, as Julia calls it. And that's all the more surprising because Google is notorious for hiring certain kinds of people with a certain profile of characteristics, engineers, essentially, most of them, with very strong technical backgrounds and so on. And in fact, if you look at the technical parts of their work, it works pretty well. You start looking at the social organizational parts, how they fit in, how they're viewed by their colleagues and so on, all kinds of red flags go up. So a lot of tricky issues.
Okay, I think it's actually about 12:30. Gary, are you willing to stick around and answer questions?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have any questions afterwards, Gary will answer the questions. In the meantime, can we give Gary a hand and thank him for coming?